Good afternoon and good evening. Welcome to the webinar, Wednesday's webinar on traps for the unwary, quality systems, design controls before you manufacture. I'd like to introduce myself, Peter Austen. I'm a senior consultant with Brandwood Biomedical. Briefly, I have over 25 years experience working in the medical device industry, various roles, from engineering, project management, quality and regulatory management. I have experience working with regulators in Australia, USA, Canada and Europe, with expertise in quality system implementation, surveillance, product registrations, recalls, post-market reporting and investigations, critical supplier and QMS auditing. I welcome your attendance today and I hope you enjoy and get something out of this webinar. So toward the end of the webinar there will be questions, there will be time for you to undertake questions, etc. If you follow the arrow here to the orange arrow there, and then further down in this area for questions, actually type in your questions in that red area. So the agenda today will be: what are design controls? The elements that must be addressed, documenting those elements, the records required for design controls, the potential consequences of unfavourable inspections based on your design controls, and questions and answers. So what are design controls? It's a process, and in this diagram here I've identified the probably well-known waterfall process, but how well the waterfall process is detailed to show the aspects of most of the design controls as detailed in the regulations. So we have the input requirements, the user needs, which then lead into the design input, through your design process, which will be an iterative process, taken possibly many times to come up with the final design output, through verification activities and many review cycles, and then finally to the output of the medical device, which is then validated to identify that it has met the intended use and the user needs. So, from the start, planning is essential. So to ensure that you don't go through the traps during the design process, firstly, you put together the design and development plan. This plan will identify your responsibilities and authorities, your quality planning aspects. So what quality controls like design reviews and appropriate checks and balances will be put in place to monitor the development of the given project or medical device, the resources that will be required, and those disciplines and departmental interactions that will occur during the development of the medical device. You'll need to identify the phase gates or the key milestones within the project at certain points where the project team, certain parts of possibly management and key people involved in the development cycle will sit together and identify whether a particular phase that the project is going through has reached its end goal and can then move on to the next phase. And those phase gates should be taken from or based on your product development procedure. Other specifics that may be involved in the design and development plan will be particular technology that may be required or needs to be developed for the project, what equipment is needed, and are there any particular experts that need to be involved or at least consulted to as part of the development process. Inputs into your requirements documents is not just the user. There's a whole range of required inputs to develop and enhance and ensure that the intended product meets the real world and user needs. So we have, for example, standards. There's obviously the customer requirements and the user. Any regulatory requirements, whether it be from a US perspective or an international perspective, such as the Europe or AU. What corporate requirements are needed, and the risks that need to be identified early as inputs into the device requirements. Further to that, for example, have you covered clinical or the home environment? Where will the medical device be used? Will it be used in a clinical or home environment, or possibly both? Have you considered the user and the patient? Will it be a single-use device or a multi-use device? And if multi-use, does it require re-sterilization or perhaps reprocessing? Have you looked at the human factors, specifically to reduce human error? If it's a fairly complex device or has an interface, such as a GUI, how easy and understandable is that particular GUI to use? Risk management. So your failure modes, your potential risks, the potential hazards that need to be identified early, excuse me, so that you can put stopgaps in place and ensure that those hazards don't propagate through to the end device. Other inputs can also be review of complaints. If you are taking a already developed device to the next level within your own business, have you looked at and should look at your complaints records? From a regulatory perspective, medical device reports, for example, the MORE database, go through those to identify whether there's any specific areas or issues that have been identified through other manufacturers' devices that could help with the input into the requirements of your new device. Any special conditions you may have. And most importantly, the regulatory requirements, such as 13485. Just a cute one on human factors. So the mapping of requirements. Once you've identified and documented, at least for the first round of the requirements for the device, those requirements will need to be mapped. And one of the great tools that many businesses use is to develop, if you don't already have in place, a traceability matrix. And that traceability matrix helps you map all the design inputs through to design outputs to the verification and validation activities. And it will also help you identify, to the level that you want to go, what documents addresses those particular inputs and outputs. And importantly as well, don't have inputs where the outputs cannot be verified or validated easily. Here is an example of a basic traceability matrix. So you identify your input requirements. That input requirement number is then matched to a particular description. and then through to the affected areas within the device development. It could be hardware, it may be software, it could be electrical. Then from a fairly simplistic input description to a detailed design description, then on to the various specifications, verification activities and validation activities. And then a final check at the end, has that input requirement been met? The structure and information in the matrix is developed to meet the design and control needs of the particular project and the business at hand. Design verification and design validation. So basically, does the output meet the input requirements? Do you have records of inspections and tests? And does it work in the laboratory? That will define your verification. But most importantly, the records of the verification activities undertaken is critical when looking at the project to move on to the next stage, and also at potentially inspection or audit time. And the same applies for validation. Do all the overall outputs meet the intended use and the user needs? Do you have the evidence of the clinical evaluation, whether it be a clinical study or a combination of clinical study and document reviews and clinical evaluation? In other words, does it work in the real world? Did you design the right product? From there, we start going into design reviews. So design reviews are a snapshot during the project lifecycle to capture that the project is developing as intended. So the amount of design reviews that will be required really will depend on the complexity and the risk of the particular device being developed. It could be 1, 2, 3, possibly many design reviews that are taken over the period of the project. For example, it could be an input requirement stage, so that all the requirements are reviewed by the panel or the team members to identify that the various areas have been captured from an input perspective. There may be one then at design verification stage, possibly another at the design validation stage, and again at the design transfer. But at the end of the day, design reviews can be held at any time. It really is up to the development plan within the project to identify what you believe are the most appropriate times to have these. They don't necessarily have to be at milestones or necessarily at phase gates, which some companies will use, but they're generally good identifiers for when design reviews should occur. And who should be involved? Obviously the key project team members, any experts, and also at least one independent, so that you have a fresh set of eyes looking over the particular review at that point. Design changes. So they occur during the design phase onto manufacturing and continues through to the obsolescence of the device. It doesn't just stop when the DHF or the design history file has been compiled and the project moves into manufacturing. It is right through to the obsolescence of the product. But some of the key points when looking at design changes are your design changes documented? How well have those changes been documented? Have the changes been reviewed by the same functions? Not necessarily by the same individual, but by that function. If not, why not? Just put your justification in place. Have assessments been undertaken for the impact of those changes? What V&V activities were performed to confirm those changes? And most importantly, don't forget software. Not just in the sense of a device, but support software, test software, spreadsheets with macros, and other forms of software. These will and do form part of design changes. Design transfer. Is the device ready for manufacturing? Some checkpoints for this. Are all component specifications and procedures completed? Are all processes validated? Is the equipment that you are going to be used for manufacturing ready? Is the manufacturing facility ready? For example, are there special environmental conditions that are required for the manufacture of this medical device? Or storage conditions, or even access? And are your critical suppliers qualified? Critical suppliers where a supplier may be producing a very complex component, or it could be that they're producing an important part of the actual product in the sense of a sub-assembly. Or it could be a process such as sterilisation or disinfection. It is important to ensure that your critical suppliers identified have the appropriate records and documentation to support the DHF. And it is for the life of the product, not just the project. So toward the end and through the development cycle, as the design history file is growing in size, do you have a compilation of records, of which those records may include meeting minutes, design reviews, sketches, specifications, photos, your risk management file, plans that have been developed, protocols and reports? These will show compliance to design control elements. So in a little bit more detail within the design history file, so you have your inputs such as your product requirements documents. Your outputs will be product specifications. There will be drawings, bills of materials, possibly bills of operations. Your risk management file, which will include risk analyses such as failure mode effects analysis processes, your risk traceability matrices, etc. Your verification records, test data and certificates, raw data such as lab books. Your validation records, clinical evaluation reports, and those reports. Project management, the plans, the meeting records, those meeting records, who attended, under what capacity were the attendees, what was the scope of the meeting at the time. Same as for design reviews and also the approval of records. From a records perspective, one of the expectations for compliance of the QSR and also, for example, ISO 13485 is the establishment and maintenance of procedures. So within the design control framework, not only will there be records that are produced through the natural progression of the design history file, but procedures need to be in place to control and have a repeatable process for aspects such as the design and inputs and outputs, your design reviews, design V&V, design transfer, and design changes. These documents in the first instance could be fairly scant with not a lot of detail, but at least gives you a process to work upon and evolve so that it truly captures what the actual activities that the team is undertaking and will develop for future projects. These are all living documents. They're not written once and put in a cupboard. They're to help in the development life cycle and to help with the development of the product. At the end of the day, the procedures and records equals the design control process, and these will be audited. The things I like to say not to do, and there's probably plenty more. Don't implement procedures that control the design process when the project is completed. By that point, it'll be too late. And it will also show from a date perspective that the project was well underway long before the actual procedures were implemented. Don't try to produce the required documents after submission time. Generally, if you haven't produced the documents at the time required, the chances of actually getting to the end of producing the documents will become less and less as you'll be on to the next project. Don't change a record without reapproving and justifying why. A record is a record. It's a snapshot of an activity that occurred. If there's an issue with a record, yes, it can be annotated, but identify why and who with a date. Never use liquid paper or equivalent, and always strike through the error and initial so that the previous entry is visible. Never rubber stamp. Documents must be appropriately reviewed. Even if you're overwhelmed at the amount of documents that are being produced, time and effort to ensure that the content and the intent of the document is covered will be a saving grace when it comes to audit time or inspection time. If you rely or assume that someone else has read it or approved it for its content, that generally won't be the case because they'll be thinking exactly the same. Never approve your own work, as obvious as that may seem. Make a change without formal review. Has been brought up in many a warning letter and many 483s. And most importantly, I guess, is don't create burdensome procedures that no one will adhere to. It's nice to put in place procedures that appear to be just perfect or have been taken from another entity or have been downloaded possibly from the net. Develop procedures that replicate what your business does, and therefore they'll have greater adherence and compliance. Excuse me. So, the consequence of not undertaking appropriate design controls and not having the appropriate procedures in place. I've taken this couple of paragraphs from a warning letter to an unfortunate manufacturer. So it basically identifies that there's a lack of procedures and records. So there was no evidence of particular activities being undertaken. So for example, changes made to your initial device design, including material specification and device labeling, like change notices, change rationale, and evaluation as to whether the changes would affect device functionality or quality. And then further on, covering the design transfer aspects. Your firm has also failed to ensure that the device can be repeatedly and reliably manufactured using the production specifications when transferred to manufacturing. So the audit inspection actually obviously identified that through the lack of records and procedures, the safety and efficacy and controls of that device could not be shown. Further to that, there's a lack of design controls, potential consequences. You're unable to market the device until you have addressed the issues with the regulatory body. It could, depending on the severity of the findings, invoke a recall. Not particularly favourable for any business, but especially if it's your first medical device into the market. Your doors could be closed until things are rectified. And then further to that, your competitors will have access to the warning letters and subsequent regulatory actions. And I'm sure they'll do everything they can to let your customers know. And importantly, your reputation could be impacted. So that covers the webinar in itself. If you have any questions, please feel free at this time to put those questions through. I will do what I can to address all the questions, but if during the time that we have available, if I can't address all the questions, you will be emailed the answer. So, I have a question here from Neil McCallum. Can you elaborate on requirements for identifying essential outputs? That would be identified in the depending on the location, etc. So there's the essential requirements documents that are identified through the European Union, and there is also the essential principles documents that are identified through the AU. Those you would have covered within your within your input requirements document, and have a specific section that identifies those essential requirements. And from those essential requirements, you would map it through to ensure that they have been mapped appropriately and verified as essential outputs, such as a labelling requirement that needs to be addressed through the region that that device is going into. Sorry, I didn't see earlier that there was a little bit of noise coming through from my microphone, so I do apologise about that. Another question I have here from Chayapon, I apologise, I'll try and pronounce Nagosapura. Risk management is part of DHF. Do we need a separate risk management file? Some trainer mentioned that we need separated. Yes, it is part of the DHF, but the risk management file is a living document and should be maintained separately. So while it is part of the DHF, it can be to a great extent in a separate location, because as the device is manufactured and goes out into the marketplace, you may get feedback on the performance of that device through customer complaints, etc. And you will want to go back and visit your original risk management file to see if some of the issues or errors or feedback that you're getting from customers was initially addressed in the risk management file. I have another question from Philip Canner. He says this seems to be mainly following CFR Part 8 2030, example DHF and use of independent reviews and design reviews. What do you think will be significant changes design control in 13485 when the next versions come out in 2016? Are 820.30 and 13485 becoming more similar? I think to a great extent, yes, they are becoming more similar, but from what the draft standard has identified for the 2016 release, it will become even more focused on risk-based and the evaluation of those risks within each process, not just in the overall risk management of the device and processes identified in the manufacturing of that device, but basically all areas within, all the elements within 13.5 will become very much risk evaluated based. So at the end of the day, it would be lovely if there was a harmonised standard, and yes, CFR 820.30 and 7.3 of Section 7.3 of 13485 are very similar, but they will still have their differences, but they're not as significant as they have been in the past. So further question from Don Black. When does design control actually start in the product development life cycle? Just before design verification? Good question, Don. It really starts, there is a grey area between the start of design controls and what is classified as research. But design controls really start around the input phase of when a project starts, the marketing or sales division within the company or someone else identifies that there is a need for a particular device. And to get to design verification, really your design controls are starting early, because to get to design verification you need those inputs. So to answer it, the design control process starts at the input stage. To Philip Canner, do either or both CFR 820 and ISO 13485 require a specific documented HFE process, example based on 62366 or HE75, or can your HFE methodology just be captured in the device development plan? It's a very good question, Philip, and with that particular one, I'd like to take that offline and send you an email on the answer to that. Further down for Romit Singh, is clinical evidence part of design and development, in brackets product realisation clause 7.1, please advise how? Clinical evidence is really the validation aspect of design and development. So depending on the type of device that's being developed, if it's a predicate to an existing device, then some of your clinical evidence, or most of your clinical evidence, may be in the form of literature reviews, etc. If it's a fairly new device, then your clinical evidence more than likely will involve true clinical studies. So the clinical evidence aspect of design and development is the validation side. Okay, I have another question from Don Black. Is this the first time a product is being developed? Why would the burden of design control be implemented prior to the first design freeze in preparation for design verification? It's generally treated in your question will require a little bit of thought, and I think it is in this particular circumstance, Don, that I'd like to follow up with you there with an email. Okay, from Chris Kai-Young. Does the combination of verification automatically validate the device for its intended use? Or is it typically required to conduct validation separately on top of verification? Good question, Chris. It depends on what is required or what is being verified or validated. In quality system regulation speak, if something can't be validated, then it needs to be verified each time. But a verification activity is generally can be something like inspection or even the review of documentation, whereas a validation is generally from an automated perspective where once the known variables and parameters and that are set, and the appropriate run conditions are set, then you know for each time that that particular process is run that the output is going to be the same. But if the output can't be determined each time, then a verification activity is better dealt with. But there's not always the need to verify and then validate. Depending on the activity, it may be better to just verify each time, or if the capabilities are there, is to validate. I have a further question from Mario Tobias. For the traceability matrix, is it easier to map out product requirements to design verification? Do you use separate traceability matrix to map process requirements to process validation? It really comes down to the team or the individual or the project personnel, Mario. It may be easier to separate the process from design in the sense of a traceability matrix, or it may be, depending on the complexity of the device, that the traceability matrix includes both. At least if it's within the one document, it can be viewed within that same document, whereas sometimes if you have separate documents, they're not necessarily reviewed in parallel, and some things could be missed. But it really comes down to, it's your decision. Whichever you feel is the most manageable, then that's the most appropriate way to address it. Question from Romit Sin. Is prototyping considered part of design control? To some extent, depending on Romit, yes. Some forms of prototyping may be required to undertake, for example, some clinical evaluation. So prototyping is very much part of design control. 3D modelling, for example, before you move into more expensive process adaptations. For example, 3D printing is being more highly used now to prototype devices in a more rapid sense over technologies of days past. So yes, prototyping is considered part of design control, but you will also identify what is the relevant aspects of the prototyping you're undertaking, and in what part of that process it is involved in. Cameron Elvey. I too would be interested in your email response on the use of clinical evidence in the design validation question, if that is possible. Thanks. Yes, I will include that, Cameron. Then I have another question from Jack Verbeck. If you verify the device each time and trend the data over a period of time, then can this turn into validation? Good question, Jack. Generally, the verification activities will be undertaken by a user, a person on the line, for example. So in the sense where, in many ways where humans are involved in the process, then that particular area within the process cannot be validated, but it's your level of confidence that's growing in the verification activities. And what you may be able to identify is, depending on what is being verified each time, if the results are consistent, then the level of verification may be able to be reduced. But no amount of verification generally identifies that the process has been validated. From Tara Carruthers, I would be interested in being copied on your response to Don Black about design control. I will add you as well, Tara. All right, I think at this point that are all the questions that have come through. I'll wait a minute or two to see if anyone else has any other questions they would like to ask. But in the meantime, I do appreciate your time today, and I also appreciate the feedback. I've just put up a slide there on the capabilities of Brandwood Biomedical. So if there's anything additional that you need or are inquiring about, please get in contact with us. Okay, I have a question that's come through from Philip Canner again. Can you describe what a procedure for dealing with conflicting requirements as called for in CSR 820 might look like? If you could sort of, Philip, if you could go into a little bit more detail there, I'd appreciate it. From Elaine Darby, hi. Would also like to be included in your response in respect to clinical evidence required for validation. Okay, Elaine, I will include you as well. This is obviously quite a popular question here. I've had the same request from Jack Verbeck, so yes, Jack, I'll add you as well. And I've also had a request from Elise Richards. So yes, Elise, I will include you in the email response. Okay, in the QSIP, sorry, from Philip again, Philip Canner. In the QSIP manual, it states that there needs to be a procedure during requirements capture to deal with requirements that may be conflicting, such as from different standards. All right, so you would document the relevant conflicts, run a risk assessment against those conflicts or a gap analysis, and identify either the worst case scenario and adopt that from the standard, or depending on the conflict, which process or standard does this conflict best address? Does that answer your question, Philip? My pleasure. Naresh Jagtap has a question. Would it be possible to email your presentation copy? Yes, this presentation is being recorded, and within a day or two the presentation will be made available to all those people who registered for this particular webinar. So yes, it is possible to receive the presentation and the recording that went with it. Thank you, Naresh. All right, I think that's the end of the questions. As I mentioned in the early part of the question and answer slide, I will respond to everyone that has requested email notifications on particular questions today, and I really appreciate your time in this webinar today. And of course, if we can be of any further assistance with anything, including if I can answer any further questions on design controls and the potential traps, please do send an email through. I appreciate your time today. Good afternoon and good evening.